Well, hi, everyone. Welcome to Interchange. I'm Dan Jones. Thank you so very much for joining us once again. We have lots of good stuff to talk about today. Milwaukee County's top cop has a new radio spot running, urging people to go out and get guns to protect themselves. We'll talk about a 14-year-old Sheboygan kid who is going to be tried for murder as an adult. We will wonder about the wisdom of putting women on the front lines in combat situations. And we will talk about Secretary of State Hillary Clinton blowing up at Wisconsin Senator Ron Johnson. All right, time to introduce everybody. You know longtime newspaper columnist Joel McNally, as well as Kevin Fischer, former broadcast journalist, political analyst, and oftentimes a fill-in host over on WISN Talk Radio. You know Denise Callaway, community affairs and public relations professional, and Gerard Randall, education consultant and local job creation expert. Rick Horowitz will be along with commentary at the end of the show. All right, the first thing we're going to talk about is Milwaukee County Sheriff David Clarke's new radio spot. He urges people to go out and buy guns and take a gun safety training course so they can protect themselves and their families. He says there just aren't enough cops anymore to think you're going to be able to call 911 and just protect yourself and expect the police to protect you. He says, go get a gun. Kevin, is this outrageous or is it common sense?
It is common sense. I don't see anything wrong with this. He is encouraging people to, if they want to, do what is necessary to protect themselves. Go out and take a safety course. Go out and buy a gun. And what did he say that was wrong? Everything he said was undeniably true and correct. I mean, he was not being critical of local law enforcement. It's a fact that if you call 911 when your house is being burglarized, maybe by an armed person, that it's going to take some time for the police to get there, and by that time, it may be too late. You may be seriously injured or even dead. So I see absolutely nothing wrong with this. He is simply encouraging people to, if they want to, consider taking these steps, legal and practical, to protect themselves.
Denise, I was playing this spot in my office today and somebody walked in and said, man, he's lost it.
Well, you know, when I heard this, I'm kind of reminded, you know, in television shows, they talk about there's an episode when a show jumps the shark and it's all downhill from there. I think this is the occasion where the sheriff, with all due respect, has jumped the shark. He does, in fact, tell people you cannot depend on 911. He's telling people, first of all, by the stature that he has through his elected office, this is someone who is supposed to be a law enforcement expert. He is, in essence, telling them, you can't count on us, you need to do it yourself. This is not the 1800s. This is not Tucson, where we had the OK Corral shootout. I think it is, and as other local officials have said, I think it is absolutely irresponsible for him to have given the message that he has given to people. It does not recognize the fact that while we may not have as many police officers as we would like to have, and we know that he certainly doesn't have as many law enforcement folks as he would like to have, it is critical if you are an officer of the court, and that is what he is, and you want to follow the rule of law, you do that by telling people these are the things that you do. And he has absolutely ignored that at, quite frankly, I believe, an effort to somehow benefit personally from this absolutely, and I don't use this word often, but I mean it sincerely, idiotic idea.
Is this a shot at Chris Abele for cutting his budget?
No, it was a shot at everybody. And speaking of shots, not only that, it was irresponsible and it was dangerous. It's not even good advice. You know, serious law enforcement people do not tell people to arm themselves and shoot it out with bad people. They really don't. You get that advice all the time from serious police chiefs and people in law enforcement. Cooperate with a dangerous person. Get away from them if you can, but don't try to take them on yourself. But it is, what Denise said when he tells people in this community. This is a guy whose department is involved with patrolling the freeways and bailiffs in the courtrooms. This is not the top law enforcement officer in any of these communities because the police are doing that. And he's telling them, you can't count on the police. You have to be vigilantes. You have to, arm yourself with dangerous weapons. And he almost belittles the idea that, well, you could just hide under your bed, but but I want you in the game. I want you armed. I want you ready to take on, you owe this to your family, you know, to arm yourself with deadly weapons and try to kill another human being. That is irresponsible. It is dangerous. Responsible leaders all over this country right now are trying to reduce gun violence. They're not trying to increase it and increase the number of deadly weapons in the hands of people who have never had them before.
But in all fairness, David Clarke knows more about law enforcement
and any of the people sitting in this studio
than any of us, than quite possibly anybody in Milwaukee.
Well,
not law enforcement.
And what I would have hoped is that the sheriff would have stopped with, go out and get a gun safety course, to take a gun safety course if you're going to make sure that you know how to handle firearms responsibly. The message went beyond that. It then bothers me that it leads to folk who are unstable, and we've seen far too many instances of that make accusations against those that might not be accurate or true, and then that person loses their life. We've had young people where that's happened. And so I think it increases the amount of uncertainty that can then lead to people being very remorseful after there's been some type of tragic death. So again, you know, I just feel that had he stopped with, go out, take a gun safety class, be a responsible gun owner, that would have been fine, and I don't know how this is going to play.
He has personally, by this action, created a potentially volatile and dangerous situation in our community, and he personally bears responsibility for what happens as an outcome of this.
All right, next topic. Two 14-year-old boys in Sheboygan have been charged with the brutal killing of a 78-year-old great-grandmother, grandmother to one of the boys. Today, one of the kids entered a not guilty because of mental disease or defect plea, and his lawyer said they would not fight to have the case moved from adult court to juvenile court, which raises the question, should any 14-year-old in America ever be charged as an adult for any crime, or should all alleged killers be tried the same?
I certainly, there's plenty of evidence that any human being alive is not who they are going to be when they're 13 years old. I don't care, of course this was a horrible crime. It was a grandmother who was murdered for no apparent reason. But by sheer brain development, a 13-year-old is not who they're going to be 10 years later, 20 years later, or, you know, the rest of their life. When this young man, you know, pled not guilty by reason of mental disease, that's a pretty good description of 13-year-olds, as a matter of fact. Anyone who's raised children know that young people are simply not adults. They do not make rational adult decisions sometimes. They do not make even decisions that would make sense to them at a later period. And the criminal justice system, this whole move towards trying children as adults, and the Supreme Court has ruled out some of the worst punishments and some of the worst things that could happen, but that this child, who was a 13-year-old when he committed the crime, he's 14 years old now, could in fact spend the rest of his life in prison. His life could be over for something that he did when he was 13 years old, and that should not happen to anyone.
But are some crimes unforgivable?
You know, you have to figure a way, the courts have to figure a way to balance retribution, which oftentimes a community demands, families will demand as well in some of these heartbreaking cases, against rehabilitation. And I strongly believe that someone who's young ought to have a chance at rehabilitation, but I also believe that we've got a whole new generation of young people that are far more sophisticated than what we would want to admit to, but they don't have the kind of guidance that we would expect or hope that they would have when they're growing up also. And they don't play by the rules that we may have played by when we were younger. And they certainly don't play by the rules that we expect of them as adults. So, you know, I'm actually kind of torn between how I think this ought to play out for these two 14-year-olds. And I feel badly for a jury that would have to make the decision too. There is a part of me that really understands, as Joel pointed out, you've got some mental incapacity issues that have to be resolved by the courts, and experts will no doubt be called in to address that, and some societal issues too that will have to be addressed over the long haul. But it still comes down to me to a balance between rehabilitation and retribution.
Kevin, it's one thing to argue for rehabilitation if it's a burglary or a robbery or beating up somebody up at school, but if it was a brutal murder, does anybody deserve a second chance, even if they're 10 years old?
I think it's fantasy island to think that these two youngsters can be rehabilitated and will suddenly become, good pillars of the society. And they shouldn't be given a free pass after a few years in juvenile detention. Now, I covered this in my previous journalistic life, and 10, 15, 20 years ago, one of the main reasons you did not want to try 17, 16-year-olds as adults is if found guilty, you really didn't want to mix them in with the adult population for obvious reasons. But as you alluded to, these juveniles are not committing juvenile-like crimes, the type of crimes that we would associate with our youth. Right. They are committing egregious offenses that I think deserve stiff punishment. If found guilty, I think they will be, you can put them in, juvenile detention until 18, but then lock them away for a long, long time. This is murder we're talking about.
Denise, is there any room for forgiveness for a crime like this?
Well, I think that's the decision of the family to decide whether or not they'll forgive. Our decision as a society is to go through the process of jurisprudence, find out if they're in fact guilty, and then determine what their punishment should be. I agree with Joel. The 13-year-olds, we know their brains, quite frankly, are not even fully developed. I mean, that clearly is an issue. And so part of me, I feel very much like Gerard, torn about this. Part of me recognizes that, realizes that this is not something that this young person would have done when they were 20 years old. The problem we have is that they did it. And I don't think we want to be in a position where someone is tried in juvenile court and then at the age of 18 for a crime that has been this horrific, they're released back into society. I have to tell you, I don't think that as a 14-year-old, maybe 15 by the time the trial's all through, spending 3 years in a juvenile justice system is punishment enough for what was done. Because even though this child's brain may not be fully developed, there has to be an adequate and I think severe punishment based on the violence of the crime. It's not like they, and not that this would be any better, it's not like they hit her over the head and she hit her head on a table. They hit her so hard with an axe that it stuck in her skull. The other thing I think we have to realize when we talk about these young kids committing these horrific crimes is that we are seeing more kids create at younger ages, create increasingly violent crimes. So we can talk about what we need to do on the back end.
At the behest
important.
Of others.
Correct, in some cases. But we also have to figure out what we do as a society to identify these kids who have this potential for violence to the extreme, and then figure out how we treat them before these
their age
happen.
Should not be an excuse or a mitigating factor when they commit these bloody crimes.
But in fact, just to make it clear, what we weren't talking about just holding these kids until they were 18. The punishment at this age could be up to 25 of incarceration, and they're going to be an entirely different person at 25 than they are right now.
All right, next topic. The Obama administration announced this week it's going to end the longtime ban on having women serve on the front lines in dangerous combat situations in the military. Is this just a matter of equality? And is the public going to tolerate it when the number of women killed in combat starts climbing dramatically, Kevin, and those bodies start coming
Well, that's a very good question. It's bad enough now that we have young male soldiers being returned home in caskets. That's bad enough. But will the American public have the stomach and be able to cope with the situation when the soldiers coming home are now young women? I have to be honest here. Usually on this program, I have a pretty clear thought of how I view the controversial issues we talk about. I have mixed feelings about this one. 20 years ago, I maybe would have said no. Now I say, there probably are some women, not many, but some that could probably stand up to the rigors being on the front lines. With today's blurred lines in war, you can also argue that the women that are in Iraq and are in Afghanistan are already in combat. Mm-hmm. Do they deserve a shot? Sure. Okay, but
to use a metaphor,
and that's all it was, and unintended. But I do have some concerns about the compromising the strength of our military and the very lives of all of our soldiers. I mean, this is really grueling stuff that isn't glamorous. I read an article this week where American soldiers were interviewed and said, "Look, we don't male soldiers. We don't take baths for a month. We urinate right next to each other in cramped tanks. This is not for the faint of heart." I don't think a lot of women are going to be jumping to take this opportunity. You had 2 women who tried to do it in the Marines last year. They volunteered and couldn't pass muster. But I'm willing to give it a chance if they're qualified and it doesn't compromise the ability and the effectiveness of our military.
Is it more than a matter of equality, Denise?
No, I think it really is just that simple. It's a matter of equality, and it's equality in terms of, like most women, I consider myself a full citizen of this country. I don't think there's a little asterisk next to my citizenship because of my gender. And I think that these young women who have been in combat, I mean, we have tragically we've had all the young people die that we have had, particularly in Iraq, when it was not necessary. But if we take a look at young women, we've had 150 women die during the time that we have been in Iraq and Iran. Unfortunately, one of them was a young woman from here. So we know that women are dying. We know that women are receiving Purple Hearts. They're receiving Silver Stars. They're receiving other medals and commendations that are absolutely inextricably linked to combat service. One of the major problems about this is, I think that we need to also realize what the structure of the military is. And the structure of the military is such that if you're a woman who decides you want to dedicate your life to your country and do that through service in the military, and you want to make this your career, you hit an artificial ceiling, because in many cases, to advance in the military, you have to have combat experience.
Should we take it one big step further and make women register for the draft as well? Starting at age 18?
I don't believe in anyone registering for the draft, and I would prefer that neither men nor women, go into combat and go to war, and that our leaders didn't make it as easy to go to war as they have. But Denise's point is absolutely true about the promotions and how you get ahead in the military. One of the most, and women have been killed in combat, but one of the most dangerous situations for women in the military, we have learned recently, is the likelihood they will be raped by their fellow soldiers. If, in fact, women, because you have to have combat experience to be promoted, have been promoted up through the ranks the way men have been promoted up through the ranks, that would have not been tolerated to the degree that it has under this male-dominated leadership who does not even understand those issues. And that when you take away equality, you're leaving out voices and leadership that we should have in our military.
Is it sexist that there's no women who play linebacker in the NFL? Is it sexist to say maybe women shouldn't be on the front line? Are we a society now where we just say, oh no, we've got to allow women to do everything?
No, there's still going to be those places where women won't have opportunities even if they think they should. We've seen women participate in hockey, for example. There are some women that have chosen to try out wrestling. Football may be one of those last bastions where it doesn't happen. But I think in the military, as long as the military has adequate processes in place to determine emotional and physical fitness to serve, and that there are supports in place for both men and women who serve in combat upon their return from combat, should they return alive, then I don't see where there's a huge problem.
All right, we move on. I'm sure you've seen the video clip of Secretary of State Hillary Clinton yelling at Wisconsin Senator Ron Johnson the other day when he kept pressing her for details about the killing of our diplomats in Benghazi. It was all over the national news, all over the national newspapers. Does Senator Johnson look foolish, or was he simply asking the exact questions that so many Americans would like to ask about exactly what happened in Benghazi and how it was presented to the public? Denise.
Well, it wasn't that he was asking details about what happened in Benghazi. What caused her to, I think, rightfully show signs of frustration after she had been testifying in detail for a significant time on the Hill was he was asking her questions about what Susan Rice said on Sunday morning talk shows and who knew what about what she was supposed to say and who told her this. First of all, that was not the purpose of the hearing. That was not the purpose of the hearing. And I think when she responded, not once, not twice, but several times to him before she, I think said, look, why are we talking about this? This is not the point. She answered him very respectfully. The problem is that the questions that were being directed to her had nothing to do with the hearing. And I think she rightly said, what does some of this matter? She was right. And I think, quite frankly, that I think she showed in that performance, not just in that one clip, but in her entire appearance before
all day long.
Yeah, the Senate committee, that her strength as our diplomatic leader over the past 4 years, and certainly without doubt, her concerns about the diplomatic corps, to the point of telling Congress numerous times, and particularly the Senate, here's our problem. We asked you for $500 million to increase security at these embassies, and you all turned us down. We asked you if we could take $150 million we already had and move it someplace else, and the Republican-controlled House wouldn't let it happen.
In all fairness, we only have a minute. She said, what does it matter? A lot of the...
It matters a lot when you have dead American soldiers.
A lot of people later said it matters a great deal.
And when we were misled, and people on this very program bought into the line that it was all about a YouTube video when it was not, when it was real terrorism at place.
No, look, I think at that point in time, we all
had your chance,
it.
Denise.
So
Oh, we didn't. Way back when in Watergate, when the question was asked, what did you know and when did you know it? Liberals thought that was a moment of heroism. That's what Ron Johnson did. He asked, what did you know and when did you know it? And then she went into theatrics.
No, he didn't.
You know what? After 9/11, both parties in this country came together because this country had been attacked. When this country was attacked in Benghazi, the Republican Party tried to make it an issue in the election. Mitt Romney embarrassed himself, and Ron Johnson embarrassed this state.
Okay. You may have noticed this President Obama was sworn in for a second term this week. And if the crowds were somewhat smaller this time around, the president's world seemed stronger. His words seemed stronger, at least to most Republicans. They were stunned. Rick Horowitz, not so much. Rick?
Here's what it's like. It's like the guy who won't ask this one girl to the prom because he's counting on getting a date with the best-looking girl in the whole school. Except that when the time comes, the best-looking girl tells him to get lost. So then he goes back and asks the first girl, and she's already made other plans. That's what it's like. Happy prom night, John Boehner. Happy prom night, Mitch McConnell. What a hoot, listening to all these Republican talking heads complaining that the president's inaugural speech was too partisan. He wasn't offering compromises. He wasn't saying he'd meet them halfway. Imagine that. And after winning by nearly 5 million votes, what nerve. These guys had 4 years to make compromises, to agree to something less than their ideal. But they were counting on scoring big in 2012 with their dream girl, Electra L. College. And by the time they found out she was out of reach, Plan B was off the table. And now they're so upset. Why wasn't he bipartisan like inaugural speeches always are, like he was the first time around? They're right, he was pretty bipartisan that first time around, January 20, 2009. And something else happened in Washington that day, too. A group of high-power Republicans, congressional leaders, top consultants, got together for a consolation dinner that turned into a strategy session. And the strategy they came up with? Oppose Obama on absolutely everything, even things that were originally their own ideas. Fight him at every turn, make him fail. Make him, in Mitch McConnell's famous phrase, a one-term president. Of course, Obama didn't know about this dinner at the time, which is why he kept offering deals, compromises that he thought would appeal to them. But they were making a different calculation. They were betting on 2012. Oops. So maybe these next 4 years will sound a little more assertive. But we shouldn't be shocked. Here, listen. Progress may be slow, the president said, measured in inches and feet, not miles, but we will progress. It is time to reawaken this industrial giant, to get government back within its means, and to lighten our punitive tax burden. And these will be our first priorities, and on these principles, there will be no compromise. Pretty strong stuff, and right out of the president's first inaugural address. President Reagan's first inaugural address.
Thank you, Rick, and thank you so very much for watching. Stay warm. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.